Good morning, everybody. My name is Chris Cochran. I work for the Department of Housing and Community Development, and you are at the Rural RAA weekly, and we're gathered here and vision documents that are those posted, or do we post them after we talk, or how does that work?
I believe they are posted, and I did send them around.
Other parts of the agenda, we're going to talk about our next assignment, which is kind of dialing in our action steps as far as they fit into our pathways and strategies. But before we go into the fun part of the meeting, are there any changes to the minutes? Have folks reviewed them? Any opposition to adopting them?
I don't think we've actually voted on any previous minutes.
Yeah. Do you want to vote? I noticed I was just kind of following Catherine's lead, like nobody ever seems to vote, but we can vote.
No. I think it's just, are there any comments, right?
Yeah, and seeing if there's any opposition to approving them, but it's not an official vote.
Nope.
So, no comments. All right. Any adjustments to the agenda from anybody? All right, hearing none. Are there any kind of just updates or public announcements? I know I have a few that I talked with Marion about. Just some updates on public engagement, some updates on the smart growth study. Some other members did have a check-in with House Energy and Technology. I think it'd be helpful to just kind of get some perspective on that. There's also a Vermont Digger article that's not complete, but it tells you some of the story. And then the reason we're here today is these goals are going to be talked about at the large VCC meeting on Monday. So that's why we gotta get our work done. Any other?
Nope.
So, Mary, can you update us? There was a meeting last week to talk a little bit about public engagement. There's interest in getting the consultant to help. There was a conversation. I wonder if you could just share a little bit more about kind of what you think is going to happen next there.
Sure. So if you all recall, a couple of meetings ago, we had some significant discussion about stakeholder groups that we would want to engage with. So a reminder about sort of the general approach to public engagement. We have a couple of different types of public engagement events that we'll be conducting primarily in September and a little bit into October, and then after adoption of the initial plan as well. And I can talk about what that means. But this part of public engagement is what we would consider or calling stakeholder engagement events. So the idea of that came from Cross-Sector Mitigation Subcommittee, which is conducting, they've had two already and they have one next week, specific sector-specific events with so folks in the transportation sector that are subject matter experts that may have technical input on their pathways and strategies and actions that they're proposing. They were conducting those jointly with the Department of Public Service, both in service to the Comprehensive Energy Plan update and the Climate Action Plan update. Or Climate Action Plan drafting. So we thought it would be helpful to have the Agriculture and Ecosystem Subcommittee and Rural Resilience and Adaptation Subcommittee also think about if you all would want to conduct specific stakeholder events where you're really talking to a group of folks that are the ones on the ground implementing perhaps many of the actions that we're proposing for the Climate Action Plan. So they may have specific input on a policy or a new program or adjusting of a program. This is different than the sort of broader public engagement events that we'll be holding at the end of September. And those are more focused on broad engagement with the public, asking about, what they feel are the impacts of climate change, what they would like to see. It's different than really this sector specific engagement. So we discussed with this subcommittee, and then Erica and Catherine asked, I think for Kristen Bronwyn volunteered to meet with the Agriculture and Ecosystems co-chairs to discuss those engagement events further. we had a lot of discussion around sort of the benefit of tapping into the same group of people multiple times, and whether that would be sort of not as helpful to our discussion of strategies and actions as we thought. What we finally landed on were 3 stakeholder events, one around forestry, one around agriculture, and one around rural communities. Now, rural communities is a really broad topic, and it's going to be, we're looking for volunteers from this subcommittee to help craft the agenda for that event, the invite list for that event, and really work to bring that event to fruition with support from CBI, Consensus Building Institute. So I sent out an email. Chris and Bronwyn and myself identified some folks who we thought might be interested from the subcommittee, but I do want to open it up to anyone, even if you didn't receive the email. What we're looking to do right now is schedule a meeting next week with those folks that would be interested in planning and putting on that event, to meet with CBI to discuss the logistics of it and pick a date and then move forward in planning. I haven't received any responses to the doodle poll that I sent. So I'm putting this out there perhaps for a bit of conversation, and also to see, are folks interested in helping to plan this event, to helping to get it off the ground, identify those that we think need to be involved. If not, then it may not be something we need to take on, but I do think there was interest initially in engaging with these communities. I think pointing to the House testimony a couple days ago, I think legislators identified the need to engage with rural communities. And I will say, in discussing this with the Agriculture and Ecosystem Subcommittee about 2 hours ago, there's some folks there that are also interested in engaging this event. So if we have folks from the subcommittee that are interested in helping take this on, please let me know, and we can talk about it just a bit now if needed. Jens, go ahead.
Yeah, I just signed on to the poll before this meeting, so I'm in there.
Great, awesome, thanks, Dave.
Okay.
And I'm willing to help as well.
Okay, I will put the link to the poll in the chat. We do have to be a little conscious of quorum, and if we get over a certain number, then it has to be a warned meeting for next week.
I'm unclear if I'm an official member or if I'm considered staff.
You're, I think, staff support, so I think you're actually outside the quorum number. Yep, just letting folks know about that. But any questions about that? I will say, I know it sounds a bit broad, and I think that's because we're looking for this subcommittee, and I think a couple volunteers from Ag and Eco as well, to help define what we really need to engage with rural communities on. We're not going to be able to engage with them on everything. So it's going to be a real, we're going to have to think a little bit about what specific strategies do we think are going to have the biggest impact and perhaps be the most controversial, that we really need to dig in with a specific group of stakeholders on. And that's the intent of these meetings.
I have a question. So at the last meeting, we outlined a bunch of topic areas, we kind of organized topic areas. And so now I'm a little confused. How does that relate to now these, what you said are these 3 focus areas?
It's one and the same. It's just developed a step further. So I think in long conversation at a subsequent meeting, I think the 2 that we decided upon were infrastructure and something focused on rural communities. And there was a discussion that we would be targeting the same group of people for that event. So we should combine it into one event.
Okay.
If you all think that we should go a different direction, and if there's a benefit to having those 2 separate meetings, I think Chris and Bronwyn, if you all could weigh in as well, I know because you all were in that conversation, but that was the kind of thought process as we were kind of taking those and thinking about who we would actually have coming to those events.
The one thing I would add is, Catherine is the appointed representative for rural areas. So I really, she was unable to attend that meeting. So I think, as we dial this in, I think it's important to get her thoughts and feedback on how to best structure this. It'll be challenging. And, I guess the question I have for you, Marion, is it just Ag and Eco in our group that we're saying, here's the things we're thinking about, or is it broader than that? Because there's potentially a lot of policies that will, disproportionately affect rural parts of the state versus other parts of the state. And if you don't have an answer, we don't need to go in the weeds. So.
No, I think while the cross-sector mitigation events were planned obviously a couple of weeks ago because they were happening 2 weeks ago, this week and next week, I think there was thought of bringing some of those events in. Those were a little bit of a different approach, but I guess to your point, there's nothing stopping, cross-sector mitigation from pulling folks in to think about this agenda planning and what's presented to those rural communities. So I think what we're trying to do now is get a meeting on the books for next week to talk about these details, to say, what do we want to accomplish? What's feasible in a virtual meeting? What date and time works, and then move from there into agenda setting and who we reach out to. Again, these will be public meetings, anyone can attend, but I think we want to do some targeted outreach to see, if we can get certain groups of folks to come, depending on what you all want to discuss. So again, I'll put the link in the chat once I pull up my email to the doodle poll. If you're interested, please fill out the doodle poll. I'll schedule the meeting based on the highest response, and I'll invite everybody that responds to the doodle poll. So.
Joe, you look like you want to say something.
Who, me?
Yes.
Oh, well, just I've made this comment before, but are we not concerned about resilience in non-rural communities? And I mean, especially if you're going to be talking about smart growth, well, where's most of the smart growth going to go? It's going to go in non-rural communities. So that's one comment. The other one is just, if you're sending out a doodle poll, I think I'm interested to help, but next week is really full for me, so I'll just have to see what's available. I know I keep asking that question, so and maybe the answer is that's not what the Global Warming Solutions Act is concerned about, and so maybe we should just stick with the direction that it's giving us. But it's just a question I keep having in my mind.
I struggle personally with what do we mean by rural, in our state. So who are we trying to reach? So all good questions. Just to pick up one other thing that Marion mentioned, that CEP engagement, Brahma and I, and probably Jacob Hemrick from our team are going to present probably a land use component next Thursday. There's a workshop on transportation and land use. So we'll be doing some engagement around that. I think it'll just be very high level, and we're just trying to get people to talk and kind of get some of their ideas and thoughts. I don't think we're not gonna have our actions yet, so I don't think we can actually get good feedback on details at this point. But just kind of setting the stage for kind of where we're going. Anything you want to add to that, Bronwyn? Not to put you on the spot, but
no, just to again highlight that some of the land use stuff is, we just had this conversation about land use and rural versus non-rural. And so in the transportation meeting, there'll be an interesting dynamic because it's land use related to transportation, not land use related to a whole host of other potential outcomes or connections. So just to flag that, this land use thing is kind of showing up in different categories of things. And so it'll be interesting to see how it comes together.
Oh, it's coming together. The other thing, just some updates just for everybody. I know there was a conversation about looking at VMT related to land use, and if we could just get a brief update on kind of where that is. I don't know if that's you, Joe, or Bronwyn.
Well, I can start, I guess. We met, we had a group of us that met, I think was it last week or maybe it was earlier this week. And I think, to cut to the chase, we decided that we're not gonna, do a fire drill and try to do a detailed analysis that will help quantify the greenhouse gas benefits of smart growth, because the inventory that's being done, or the evaluation that's being done by the consultant for the cross-sector mitigation group, they have to present their numbers like in mid-September. So, there's really not enough time to do a study that I think we could all feel comfortable about, and maybe would be more comprehensive, that looks beyond, not just the pure VMT reduction benefits of smart growth, but other benefits that, sort of secondary maybe in some respects, or that help reduce greenhouse gases as well. And so, and I guess the plan is that the climate action plan can identify that sort of comprehensive study as an action that would happen pretty quick, as I understand what Jane was saying. There's potentially some funding left from the Global Warming Solutions Act. So there could be, you know, a study that's done that can help quantify that, I guess, a little more in a better way than just kind of rushing through it right now.
Yeah.
They are going to try to include some account for the benefits of smart growth using whatever information they can gather just from a national literature search, you know, like smart growth reduces VMT by 10% or something like that, and they'll kind of crunch those numbers. So anything else, Bronwyn? Did I miss anything?
No, I think the key thing is that the greenhouse gas model that they're using does have essentially a VMT factor. And so the question is, well, how much can land use impact that VMT factor? And, you know, I think we would love to do some real Vermont specific analysis around that, which, as Joe mentioned, seems like a bit of a fire drill. But I do hope that some of the more qualitative research that chemists could do could still be used to adjust that VMT factor, even if it's not, you know, Vermont analysis based. So essentially that's where it shows up in the greenhouse gas modeling, is how does land use impact that VMT factor that we use to forecast emissions.
And I apologize. I've got to duck out for a second. I've got a commissioner who needs an answer right now. So I'm going to.
Okay, thanks, Chris. I can take over for a second. Thanks, Bronwyn and Joe, for that update. And I'll just add, I think, again, so the short term is that Cadmus is going to do some literature review of some national studies to try and build something into the LEAP modeling that accounts for a change in vehicle miles traveled based on compact settlement that they can find. I think they're looking for both in dense community development and then more rural community development. If they can find studies of that across the country, it likely won't be studies from Vermont, but at least factoring that in so that when we get the analysis back from them, I think there will be some scenarios that will show us, you know, what that means in terms of vehicle miles traveled, and then what that means in terms of emissions reductions. And then the long term, as Joe said, or thinking longer term, is to really think about a broader study around smart growth and the sort of co-benefits beyond just vehicle miles traveled and emissions reductions, but really trying to focus it on Vermont, so that we have data to sort of support the actions that we're focusing on in terms of compact settlement and smart growth. And the intent, and Jane, I believe, is going to set up a meeting to start thinking about this soon, even though it won't be ready for this version of the comprehensive climate action plan. The intent is to sort of keep the momentum and some funding that we have available currently to build out that study so that we're better prepared for the next iteration of the plan. So thanks for that feedback. Okay, I don't have the agenda up. Let me pull it up one moment and then I can figure out what's next. Okay. I don't know if there's anything else Chris had on his agenda to discuss, so we can move right into the bulk of the conversation today, which is going to be around vision and goal development. So I'll set the groundwork a little bit for folks that maybe were out last week or the week before, and sort of set you all up for where we are, and then we'll dive into the conversation for today. So a couple weeks ago, we brought to the subcommittee and also to the Agriculture and Ecosystem Subcommittee the intent to have some measurable goals developed from each of the subcommittees that really help frame up the bodies of work around sequestration, adaptation, and resilience that are going to be included in the climate action plan, so that we can sort of have that included in the climate action plan with the emissions mitigation requirements that are set forth in the Global Warming Solutions Act. Understanding that it is really difficult to set goals around sequestration, adaptation, and resilience, we sort of left it to the subcommittees to think about how best to package that work and think about either measurable goals or even just a vision statement or a clear process for how to get to those types of goals. We had a discussion at the subcommittee level and then took a week off and decided to have a smaller group of folks, Ben, Bronwyn, and Mike, to meet to start thinking about a vision and a set of vision and goals to then bring back to the subcommittee. The Co-chairs are both of rural resilience and ag and ecosystems are on the agenda to present vision and goals, or what they get to and for that development for their subcommittees at the Climate Council meeting this coming Monday on the 23rd. We'll have to talk about that a bit later on because both Erica and Catherine might be out on Monday. So we'll have to think about who wants to take that on for presentation to the council. But let's first get through the work for the vision and the goals. So what we all did, and Ben and Bronwyn and Mike, please jump in if I'm missing anything or if you think there's a better way to categorize it, and I'll pull up the slides in just a moment, was starting to think about goals. Initially, we were looking at them sort of at the higher level above the pathways, so really broad goals, but thought that was pretty difficult and wasn't really getting us to a place where we felt like they were measurable goals that we would be able to eventually attach metrics to and think about in the sense of providing benchmarks for 2025, 2030, and 2050. So what we ended up doing was developing a vision statement, which is what we'll discuss first, that hopefully will seem to you all that all of the pathways feed into that vision statement, and it really gives us a clear sort of, you know, what is all this work leading us to? What's the vision we're trying to think about for Vermont for 2050? Then we have our pathways, as we have already discussed, and then we have a set of goals attached to each pathway. So what we'll do today is first talk about the vision statement, and then go through the set of goals that we drafted for each pathway, talk about that with the subcommittee, make changes to that, and see if you all feel comfortable for presenting that to the Climate Council, for someone to present that to the Climate Council on Monday. So let me share my screen here. I have some slides to show you all, and then we'll dive into the work. While I do that, Ben or Bronwyn or Mike, do you all want to fill in anything that I missed? I can't see you all, so it sounds like no.
I think you explained it pretty well, and I think once the slides come up, it'll help people too.
Great. Okay, so I'll jump through the slides here. Oh, go ahead, Mike. Sorry, cut you off. No. Okay.
No, I was done.
So I just did this mock-up. It may not be helpful, but in just thinking about, because I know there's so many layers and sometimes it feels like maybe there's too many layers, this is what we landed on. So a broad vision statement that we have the pathways that we've already discussed, and that's sort of, you know, what are we trying to get to for the pathways. Within each of the pathways, we have a set of goals, and a set is a goal for 2025, 2030, and 2050. And then the strategies and the actions are really the what and the who, the when, the where, the how. What are the specific policies and programs we're looking to enhance or develop or change? And that's really feeding into the work of the pathways. But the goals are intended to really help us set benchmarks for measurability, to talk through what it means to sort of measure success in adaptation and resilience. So let's talk about the vision statement first. And I have it up on the slide here. There's sort of just one general question to think about with the vision statement. I will say that as we're moving through this, anything that we've highlighted in red are items that the small group thought would be really beneficial to focus on with the larger subcommittee, to see if we think there's some noodling we need to do with the language, or whether that's worth including in the vision statement, and then subsequently the goals. But as we look at this vision statement, again, thinking about the pathways, and I can pull those up, they're on the next slide if you all want to refresh on the pathways, and then go back to the vision statement, just let me know. But the vision statement is Vermont's people, communities, ecosystems, and infrastructure are prepared for and more resilient to the impacts of climate change. So thinking about that vision statement, does it capture the end state that we're sort of working towards in terms of pathways and strategies and actions? And I'll just let that sit for a bit, and then anyone just feel free to jump in if you have thoughts about this.
Did you mention to the group that these are just broad goals? They're not legally binding goals. I'm sorry, I stepped out. Yeah.
I did not mention that, but thank you, Chris, for the reminder. These are not legally binding at all. It's really meant as a tool to help elevate the work of, as I said, adaptation, resilience, and sequestration, so that we're not getting to mitigation requirements, but so that we have a similar benchmark to work towards. And part of that is thinking strategically about, as we formulate the climate action plan, there's going to be a lot of actions in here that all of the subcommittees are developing. We're not going to be able, the legislature is not going to take up all 500 of the actions that are in here. So how do we start to think about prioritizing actions and thinking about metrics that mark us towards success, and then also indicate where there are programs and policies and funding sources that need to be the focus for the near term and then the long term. But not at all legally binding, as Chris said.
I have one question or one comment since the word is in red. It's the word more resilient, and I'm just wondering, more resilient than what? More resilient than New Hampshire? And I sort of understand it, right? Because we're never going to get like absolutely resilient. But maybe you guys can talk about why you added that word in.
Yeah, I actually asked Marion to add that word, and it was the fact that it just said prepared and resilient to the impacts of climate change. It was exactly what you said, Joe, is, are we ever going to be completely resilient from everything? And I was pretty uncomfortable with that. So we added in more. And your question of what more means, I was thinking more than today.
Yeah. I mean, it could be increasingly.
Increasing, yeah.
Yeah, that's a good word too.
Can you all still see this? I'm putting it in edit mode so I can make some changes.
Yes.
Okay, so maybe change more to increasingly. That's what you all are saying. Okay. Let me shift my screen here.
I think this also points to the idea that I think regardless of whether it's increasing or more or just an end state, it has to be defined. We have to define and benchmark where we're at now in terms of resilient. What do we consider to be resilient, and benchmark ourselves against that now? And then be able to measure ourselves, what is resilient, essentially. So I think either way, the challenge is going to be there. And I think part of the idea is that, that's why there's a measurable part to this. In the pathways, we're starting to try and define what are we defining as resilient? What are the measurable goals that we're coming up against? So just to say that that's a big challenge, is to define resiliency and either benchmark ourselves where we are now or define where we want to be.
This has been on that point. I agree that increasingly is the right word, because it's really a trend we're trying to achieve. The challenge is that resilience is tested and we don't know what it's going to be tested by. And so we have a small number of data points. That said, those of us in disaster management do have those data points. We've had 10 floods and 4 ice storms since Irene that were federally declared, and we have all kinds of metrics on those. So from storm to storm, we get to see how we're doing. And for example, I'm only aware of one culvert that was blown out in Irene that we've had to refix since then.
Yeah, and Ben, when we get to the slide about infrastructure, you'll see even in our goals there, we really will have a bunch of different actions for each different sector, whether it's transportation, energy, communications, wastewater. You almost have to have separate goals for each of those, right? You can't lump them all into one goal, I don't think. So,
right.
Right, and I think that's something, we're getting a little bit into the conversation about goals. So I want to keep us focused on the vision for now, but to your point and to Mike's point, as we think about the goals, understanding that, if we have, and that may be the move we want to go to in the long term, is instead of having broader goals, have, like measures of success for a number of different, for each infrastructure category or the subset of infrastructure categories. But right now, when we think about the goals that we'll be presenting, are there specific metrics that we need to start thinking about for tracking progress towards that goal? And that might be, at each of the infrastructure levels, what are we tracking in terms of resilience? But when we think about the goal, so I saw Dave put in the chat that he likes it. Thanks, Dave, for the positive feedback there. Do folks think, and I can go to the next slide, which actually shows all of our pathways, but did the vision statement capture those pathways, understanding that, we may not right now have that full measurability for resiliency, but by saying we want to be increasing resilient, we're sort of moving towards a more resilient landscape and community and ecosystems and that sort of thing. So folks you can jump in or thumbs up, or what do we think about this?
I think it's good. I just had a question. What was the question around ecosystems? Was it just?
So I sort of flagged that because we had a big, we kept talking about this both when we talked about the goals and the vision statement, is is Ag and Ecosystems going to be developing a similar vision statement also about ecosystem that we then have two vision statements that are talking about the same thing? Having come out of their meeting, they did not develop a vision statement. So I actually think it's okay to leave in right now. And maybe it's something that we collaboratively think about later on. But it was sort of thinking about right now we are pretty siloed in our, work in terms of the subcommittees and to the extent that this group, has or hasn't been thinking about the natural systems, do we include that in our vision statement? But I think it's okay to keep it as is and remove the red.
Yeah, and I would agree. I've been thinking a lot about the word ecosystems there because, of course, we want to increase resilience in wildlife populations and plant populations and the individual pieces of ecosystems. But for this purpose, I think just referring to ecosystems writ large makes more sense.
Okay. Any other thoughts? I see some stuff in the chat.
Slide down, a few more to go.
Great. All right. So I will change this all to black text and we'll move on. Great job. So the next two slides, nothing to react to yet. These are our pathways. We can refer back to them if needed. I can also pull up the pathways on the website if folks want to have that separately, but it's actually on each slide. So just pulling this up as a reference, we have 5 pathways and we've sort of developed goals for each of the pathways. So hopefully folks have had a little bit of time just to look at the things to consider as we're thinking about goals. I've listed a couple of discussion points here. I think we'll have enough feedback and discussion about each of these goals, but again, thinking about, do goals provide measurable benchmarks on the pathways that we're looking at for that 2025, 2030, and 2050 timeframe? And as we think about measurability, I think, and there is something in here about thinking about metrics to sort of define the measurability of those goals. Do we have those metrics already? Are there metrics that need to be developed for those goals? We should be thinking about that because I think that will actually inform what we're going to be getting to next week and over the next 4 to 6 weeks is really diving down into our actions and thinking about as we try and measure success and move towards our vision statement in resiliency and adaptation, what do we need in place to be able to measure success there and sort of get us to that level? So thinking about the metrics, I think, can be helpful. But the flip side of that is I don't want to get too bogged down in the metrics because we'll have an opportunity to think about that later on. So let's ensure that we're comfortable with sort of the goals and then we can think about the metrics as a supplemental step later on. Again, with that, thinking about the data, what do we have in terms of measurability and what's maybe needed, that may help frame up what makes us feel comfortable about setting for goals. Is there a need to refine these goals further? This is our opportunity to do so. And then also thinking about, if you recall, working with your task groups, are there any strategies or actions that you think we've developed that you see related to these goals? Because that's also part of the intent, is to have these goals really help us think about what actions do we need to put in place to get to that level of resiliency and adaptation. So either are there certain actions or strategies that you've thought about that actually feed well into these goals, or jot some notes down about things you think might be missing. So just some things to consider as we talk about goals, and we'll jump right into the next slide, unless anybody has questions about these.
Marion, this is Ben. I did have one question.
Sure.
We're treating the pathways as sort of non-negotiable or settled already. Have they been accepted by the Climate Council, and does the Climate Council at this point have all the pathways from all of the working groups in one place?
Yes. Well, they're not all in one place. They're in the slideshows that each of the subcommittees presented to the Climate Council, and they're all saved on the website. So okay. To the extent they haven't, there wasn't a request to formally adopt the pathways. The council sort of created the subcommittees to do that work. And when the subcommittees came to consensus, which we did on the pathways, and then presented them to the council, that was the end there. I think, if you feel strongly that we need to adjust the pathways, we are still in drafting mode, so we could entertain that, but I wouldn't drastically change.
I'm okay with what we're doing. I just think it would be helpful for us and probably the other working groups as well, sooner rather than later, to look at how our pathways fit with all the other pathways. And there may in fact be a few overlaps or rough edges that we need to reconsider.
Yep. Totally agree. And there's a proposal to get a group of counselors together to do that exactly.
Great. Okay. Thank you.
All right, so I'll move on to the next slide. So we're just going to go pathway by pathway and look at the proposals here. Again, things in red, we definitely think need further discussion, but everything's really on the table now and I can edit as we go through. So just reviewing quickly, pathway number 1 is increasing our local and regional capacity, including community and civic networks. So those local volunteers, non-government organizations, faith-based groups for resilience planning and implementation and address inequities of under-resourced communities. So, and Bronwyn, feel free to jump in. I think you are much more eloquent about speaking about these goals. I'll just go through them quickly and then you can feel free to jump in. For 2025, thinking about tools that we can develop, tools for assessing community vulnerabilities to climate change impacts have been created and made available to RPCs, local planning commissions, and civic networks. Moving on to 2030, a certain percentage of municipalities have completed a vulnerability assessment and a preparedness plan. And then by 2050, all Vermont's communities have prepared for the impacts of climate change. They adapt daily functions and needs to be responsive to unavoidable climate impacts and maintain critical services and perhaps minimize disruption during major climate events. Bronwyn, do you want to add anything in there about the breakdown of those goals?
No, I'll just add that in our discussion, we did talk quite a bit about existing tools that are out there. Certainly there's quite a lot around hazard mitigation planning. And so we just kind of elevated the idea that not only will there be changes into what those hazards look like, how frequent they'll be, the intensity of them, but then there's this whole other category of climate impacts that are just going to be sort of new normal, not necessarily discrete climate events, but just challenges in the new normal for climate that we should be thinking about as well. So we just talked a lot about the ability to build on existing tools, but expand them to include some of the sort of new learnings around the climate impacts we can expect.
Ben, you want to jump in?
Two quick things. One, it strikes me in looking again at the 2030 goal that there may be a need to go half a sentence further and add some kind of action. I mean, if we had plans on the shelf and nobody was doing anything, would it be a success? I feel like the 2030 goal is a little bit lacking in action as currently framed. So that's an open question. And in 2050, it occurs to me that we're actually making a classic error in our terminology. At the end, we say during major climate events. And I think we're actually talking about weather events, which are caused by the climate, but we shouldn't confuse climate and weather. During major events would be fine, but yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Ben. So real quick on your first point, and then we'll go to Anne. Do you have thoughts on an action to add to the 2030 timeframe? I also saw Jens shaking his head. So any thoughts on sort of how to make this a goal, a benchmark, a sort of measure of success that we're trying to achieve? Say we have, 50% or however many of municipalities who complete an assessment and preparedness plan and do what with it?
I mean, I guess one, not the only way, but one way would be and have identified actions in their hazard mitigation plans to address them. So I mean, at least that takes it down to the level of having an action proposal, because we know there's federal funding to do something once you figure it out what it is you need to do.
Which might be in pathway 3, right?
Maybe so, yeah.
The other thing too, I think we talked about a bit, sorry, and then we'll go to hands, is we haven't defined a vulnerability assessment. Like there's not a state, there's the state hazard mitigation plans, but I think in talking about those with Ben, we're not sure if those quite include a full vulnerability assessment. So I think that's part of, building to 2030 is thinking about the tools that we need to prepare for 2025 to allow those communities to assess their the impacts of climate change, and then thinking about what we mean when we talk about a vulnerability assessment, because we don't have to limit ourselves by using existing resources. I mean, these are goals that we can set for if we think there needs to be sort of a broader vulnerability assessment completed.
So actually, one way to solve it would be to have them complete a vulnerability assessment, and not just a preparedness plan, but also a hazard mitigation plan, because that calls for specific actions to mitigate the vulnerabilities.
Okay, so let's go to hands. I think Joe was first.
I think Anne might have been next.
Oh, go ahead, Ann. Sorry.
And you've kind of been zoning in on the question I had, which was, I think we've talked about GMP's tool that they've been using to identify resilient zones. We've heard about early on, we talked about a couple other tools that are in use. There's the energy burden tool that Efficiency Vermont developed. There's, I understand, an environmental justice tool that DEC is developing. There's other tools that are being developed to do similar things by national organizations or in specific states. So it feels like throwing a bunch of tools out there might not serve us well in terms of everybody kind of coming at this from the same standpoint or aiming in the same direction. So I wonder if instead of tools in plural, we do want to really have a step in here where this group figures out like the tool for Vermont to use for this work.
Thanks, Ann. Go ahead, Joe.
Well, actually, I'll just build off of that. I mean, maybe it's methods have been for assessing community vulnerability have been created and are available. So it's like a process for doing it, not just the tools, the action. I think develop a tool for utilities, develop a tool for transportation, that sort of thing. But I was gonna, my original question was, it's like what's missing from that list of, so tools or methods or whatever for RBCs, local planning commissions, and civic networks, and it's missing from the pathway too, is the state. What about us at the state level? I mean, I can't say that we've got it, all figured out. And so I'm wondering if, that would, because the way the goal is written is consistent with the pathway, which is really kind of leaves state out. So just I guess my comment is on both the pathway and the goal. Should we be thinking, I think about, we obviously, the Agency of Transportation manages a statewide network. So it's not just about at the local or regional level. And I think other state agencies, Forest Parks and Recreation, they have statewide, they have facilities statewide and so on.
So let's have folks react to that, thinking about adding the state as an entity, both within the pathway and the goal.
Increase local, regional, and state capacity. Would that cover it?
Yeah, wherever you put the word. Doesn't matter that much.
Joe, do you want to say the state, or do you want to talk about state agencies? And state agencies.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it is state agency capacity. Or state of Vermont or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's why I did capital S, but I can do state agencies.
I mean, the argument for keeping it singular would be that maybe there'll be a state resiliency office or some higher level thing that would be coordinating among state agencies. So you could do it either way.
That would most likely be part of state government though, right? It's not going to be a.
Yeah. Yeah, that's fine.
Let's form an independent nonprofit.
It's already in our pathway. How does this look with including state agencies in both the pathway and the 2025 goal? We can also think about it and move on to Chris's comment.
I just had a question. For Ben, is your concern about implementation, or do you really want to see the word that they have hazard mitigation plans?
I just wanted to see some movement towards implementation. So again, hazard mitigation plans are just one tool.
Right.
I think on that, and I getting back to Ann's point too, because we didn't provide space for reaction to that. I agree. I think calling out the methods or the tools that we have is something that we do in the action space. So when we're developing our actions, we're saying, provide more incentives or revise ERAF to incentivize more municipalities to develop hazard mitigation plans, whereas our goal, I think, should be focused on that we have municipalities that are using the tools that have been developed, because as Anne identified, there are many across the state, and I don't know if it really helps us to just kind of list them out in the 2030 goal.
Also, it's worth coming back to this. I'm already forgetting some of the other pathways, but I do think we have other pathways that are more about the implementation of, the pathways about actually getting to resilience. Just as a reminder, I read this anyway as the ultimate goal is to increase the capacity to do the work. And obviously the idea is why have the capacity unless you're going to get somewhere. But again, it's really about what do we need to do to build the capacity to then get to resiliency, potentially in another pathway and another set of strategies.
Yeah, I covered in other goals, then I'm sorry to have bogged us down on the 2030 item. We could probably move on and come back to it.
Jens, do you want to go ahead?
Well, I'm just a little bit confused because, what I read here is if we want to increase the local resilience implementation, the way we increase capacity for local implementation is in many ways by making local government more robust. Having a town manager can increase that capacity. Having additional commissions in town can increase that capacity. And yet this is talking about giving towns tools. I think that sort of misses the boat, because what we're trying to do is we're trying to strengthen the entire government at that local level in many ways, as well as all these other civic groups and so forth. So I'm not sure tools alone gets us there. And this is really, I don't know. I just want to see more action here, and leave the door open for increasing that human power at the local level.
Are you looking for tools and funding in that?
Seems like that would be another, it's important enough that it could be a standalone goal about increasing the capacity at the local level. I don't know
Which the pathway does speak to that.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how you measure that. But,
Yeah,
well,
forgive me, I know this is going to be
town manager or something like that.
Well, that's where I was going to go, Joe, is, we only have 96% of towns with a planning commission. The 4% that don't are, in my opinion, have less capacity than those that do. We only have 86% of Vermont towns that have zoning or unified bylaws. In my opinion, towns that have those sorts of regulatory frameworks are going to be more resilient.
Yeah.
So perhaps then keeping the 2025 goal with tools. And I want to think too about the timeframes that we're assigning. 2025 is pretty close. So we have one goal talking about the tools. Perhaps because 2030 is in a way still related to tools, we change that to talk about percentage increase in capacity, either through town managers or planning staff or other boards. I don't know how we want to phrase that. And maybe Jens, you can put a finer point on that. And then that's all getting us to 2050, where we have, all of our communities prepared for the impacts of climate change. I think too, actually, that's a good way it connects both to, how do we increase capacity? It's both through the people and through the resources available to them. So how do we think about that?
Well, I think earlier you said you don't want to get too caught up in the actual metrics of this. I think actually there's probably a lot of metrics that we could come up with to measure local capacity. Now, as I'm thinking about it, like the whole flood ready site, and even ERAF has like these requirements, that have to be met. And a town's ability to satisfy those requirements is often limited by its capacity to do all that stuff. So I think it's hard to just nail down one metric for that or even a goal, but it's, to me, the goal is increase the capacity of communities to become more resilient. And under that, I could see a number of measures that could go along with that.
Right. Although saying it that way, we are effectively restating the pathway.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. The pathway, that's the first sentence, right? Increase local, regional, and state
Okay.
agency capacity.
Well, so, and you know, what Jens, you said some percentage of towns have a planning staff or town, I don't remember what it was. I mean, maybe it's we take that percentage and up it. And that will,
As the goal, you mean?
and that's the goal. And the way that I think of that is there are then, you know, if that's the goal, there's one metric to track it, but that informs like multiple of strategies and actions that are going to be included in the climate action plan about ability to apply for certain funds, ability to, you know, manage additional projects. Like that goal is going to help us get to this pathway. So can you restate what that percentage was, Jens, or post in the chat if you have it?
I mean, we have, 90, I think it's 96% of towns have a town plan, and 86% of towns have a unified bylaw or zoning or subdivision. But I think that's too specific. We want to get at this people power concept, and whether it's commissions or town managers or budget, it's that ability to do work, that part of capacity that I'm trying to get at. Not just having the tool, but the people to use the tool, as Ian wrote in the chat.
Mm-hmm.
Will this come out in our actions and our, I mean, your actions are going to be measured. I mean, I think you have a valid point. I'm just wondering if this is the place to make it, or if it's more fine grained. And then I'm also concerned about time. We've got a few more slides.
I mean, the other thing we can do, we don't have to nail down, you know, a percentage right now. We could propose this as a goal that we're thinking about, and think about how to frame it. It's just, I think if folks feel like, you know, the 2025 goal and 2030 goal are both talking about tools, and we want one to talk about the people capacity, then we should, I think, rephrase it. And we could still leave it as, you know, X%, and think about how we, you know, what data we might need to actually attach to that goal later on. So if we say X% of municipalities have staff support or a planning commission, I don't know, Jens, looking to you who work a lot with municipalities, what do you think?
Yeah, or Chris, sufficient human resources.
That's what I was gonna say. Yeah, I was going to offer. It seems like it's human resources, whether that's, you know, on staff or through consultant support, but they've got resources, financial and otherwise, to have the human resources to implement the tools.
I'll just comment that at the time of Irene, less than 40% of Vermont communities had adopted hazard mitigation plans. Now people are writing 10-year anniversary stories, and we're at about 65%, covering 77% of Vermont's population. And we'll never get to 100, but I would like to see us at 80% of the communities having hazard mitigation plans in place.
Okay, so how do we feel about that language? Thinking about, Dave, do you have any thoughts? It's an RPC, works closely with towns and capacity.
I think I'm in the region that would have a hard time getting to a high percentage of communities with local hazard mitigation plans. There's been a resistance from some of these really rural communities to do that sort of thing, including zoning. But just, I guess we could set a baseline and at some point try and make sure we have more in the future than we do now. The number seems kind of arbitrary, 80%.
Mhm. I do think though, just getting back to, it does feel like if we're setting hazard mitigation plans as our goal, we're tying ourselves to one tool. I think that's a metric to measure success, as opposed to like one specific goal or the only specific goal that we set for, 2030.
I was just going to add that 2030 seems too late to me for that. I feel like urgency is way more than that. Like that should almost be in 2025.
And then, so flip them perhaps?
I did, even 2025 is 4 years away, 3, 4. So with what we're dealing with the changing climate right now,
We could say at the latest by 2025.
But you could start out by, 50% by 2025, 75% by 2030, or whatever the right numbers are.
there you go. Just to add some sense of urgency to it.
So are you suggesting adding an additional goal for 2025?
No, I was just thinking that the percent of municipalities having completed the assessment and the hazard mitigation plan by 2030, that's 9 years. And I'm just like, oh boy.
Mhm.
Uh,
Well, I think we should focus on one goal for 2030. So if we're going with the one around human resources to implement climate tools, I think this would no longer be our goal unless you all feel strongly about having 2 for 2030. I mean, the other,
That could be that could be a metric under that tool eventually. Under that goal.
Mhm.
So one way to measure it.
Mhm. Go
yeah,
ahead.
because it would be hard to complete the second goal without the first goal, right?
Go ahead, Bronwyn.
Just wanted to add that the thing that I still like about having completed the assessments and having completed preparedness plans is that they're complete, so that it doesn't talk about how they completed them and where the resources to do so are coming from, whether it's increase in local staff or whether it's use of outside resources. So just to say that maybe the statement setting aside whether 80% is aggressive enough, but making sure that the statement is that they have the sufficient resources to have completed a preparedness plan, because having the human resources also doesn't necessarily mean that they have completed a preparedness plan, that's the key thing. That is the capacity to then, if you have to have a plan to do the work. So just wanted to say that I still think having some kind of a plan as like, yes, this means that we've provided the right tools and resources for them to have completed a plan to work with.
So how's that? So we now have sufficient human resources to have a completed vulnerability assessment and preparedness plan. So we're taking the original goal and then adding the need to have the actual people power to get to complete.
I like how that reads too, because we're not saying where those people have to be.
Okay.
Which people may take wrong.
Yep. Go ahead, Anne. And I also want to say, I think you're sending me direct messages and you may want to.
I'm sorry.
No,
I'm sorry.
Okay. I think
sorry.
everybody should see your messages. So
Okay.
change it to everyone, but go ahead. You can chat.
I just feel like having enough human resources isn't enough. People need to know that they need to have awareness. They need to have a sense of responsibility, and to get our least capable towns, and I am in one of them, there needs to be some legwork done on the ground. And I think that's, that's more like a task, but it's not gonna, it won't happen we won't get to, there's no point in providing sufficient human resources if people are going to just ignore the opportunity because they don't know how to do it. They don't care about it. They have a different priority in their little town. There's more to this than it looks. There may only be a small number of towns for which this is critical, but these are our weakest towns. I'm in one. I feel it. Thanks.
Thanks, Anne. That's a really good point. And I think I'm not taking great notes here, but if somebody wants to jot down as we start thinking about metrics, that would be really helpful because, not metrics, but actions that should be tied or that need to be taken to get us to these goals. Because I think we're all acknowledging we're not going to, we can't have a laundry list goal that has every single step that we're going to need to get there. But to Anne's point, there's going to need to be sufficient, not just human resources, but training and education and, all the other components that are needed to actually show why these are important, preparedness plans and vulnerability assessments to complete. And I think that will come down to strategies and actions that either we've already developed or that we need to develop. Okay, so I do think we need to move on to Chris's point about timing. So let's put a pin in this. I think we had some good conversation. It seems like we somewhat landed on something for 2030. Let's move on to the next one. And if folks have thoughts on this, continue to put them in the chat. I can gather it up after the meeting.
Just one more comment. I think Anne just answered Joe's question on what does rural mean. And it is those towns that really have no capacity and they are incredibly rural without urban centers would be my answer.
Not to muddy the waters, but if you look at some of the income levels, some of the communities are actually very wealthy and they choose to have no capacity to keep their private wealth. Just saying.
Okay, so it's a bit more complicated than that. Good points. Okay, so pathway 2 is talking about proactively and strategically investing to enhance resilience in, and we have a number of infrastructure sectors here, transportation, communications, water, wastewater, energy infrastructure statewide. So 2025 is talking about resilient design standards for infrastructure projects. We had a lot of back and forth discussion about, is this public projects or private projects or both? Right now, we've focused it on into planning of publicly funded critical infrastructure projects with the thought and perhaps explanation later on that will feed into the private sector and perhaps Ben or Bronwyn can fill that in a bit more. 2030 is infrastructure projects are designed and constructed to meet climate resilient standards, and then infrastructure functionality is minimally impacted by the impacts of climate change. So Anne, go ahead with your hand up.
Thanks. I have a number of suggested additions here. I can go through them really quickly, but just thinking specifically from an energy and telecom perspective, the design standard is really only one piece of what I think needs to be done and what we've talked about in previous meetings. We've talked about the identification of the threats that are specific to infrastructure and the aspects of those threats and how they differentially may impact different types of communities and different geographies. So I just would suggest, adding after the first under 2025 goal, so climate threats and threat aspects and climate resilient design standards, comma, and leave the rest. I can send you all this or put it in the chat. For 2030, I think there's a missing piece here about there's just an assumption you have a design standard and then the projects will just be built to it, but there's a missing kind of evaluation piece there where you evaluate alternatives that are maybe least cost, maybe their best fit. It's not just here's the standard, build to it. It's maybe something goes in the Section 248 process around resilience. I don't know how it's going to play out, but I would suggest, infrastructure projects are designed and evaluated and constructed to meet climate resilient design standards, and a metrics framework is in place to measure the impact of these projects, because without you won't know if you have the right design standard and be able to improve upon it if you haven't actually, if you don't have a framework of metrics for resilience in place. And we've talked about metrics in the past. I know we don't want to get into that here, but there's a lot of literature out there on resilience metrics, at least for infrastructure, electric infrastructure, that, I think we can talk about as time goes on. And then just for 2050, it just seemed that saying that the infrastructure is like hardened enough, that's kind of how I read this, to be minimally impacted by climate change. It feels to me like it's kind of missing the piece that we're focusing on the communities and the people. So it's more like rural communities are minimally impacted by climate impacts to infrastructure. It kind of, that gets to the idea of you're creating these buffers, alternatives, backstops, that kind of thing, that of course you want the infrastructure to be pretty tough, but when it fails, what is kind of what remains there to support the energy needs of communities? Do they have redundancies? So I guess if we could refocus that on the community's resilience to climate impacts to infrastructure, as opposed to the infrastructure just being like super, super tough.
I think this points, Anne, a little bit to where I was saying you could have like 20 sub goals under each of these, right?
Yeah.
Like 50% of towns have solar and storage, right? That could be one, because remember, storage is in our larger document too. So, and this also has to touch transportation and water and sewer. So that's why I was thinking there's a lot more to this.
Right, which is a note I made. We discussed needing to sort of segment those types of infrastructure, talk about the climate hazards that they should be resilient to and the impacts there, which I think we captured a little bit in the 2025 statement. Other folks have thoughts or reactions on these adjustments?
I think, sorry, Mike again, is the 20, sorry, I'm just reading what you changed, but if there's known no regret types infrastructure, hopefully we don't waste 10 years talking about it before we do it. That's all. Thanks.
I'll second what Ann was saying about 2025, about knowing really where the what the threats are and where the vulnerabilities are. And I think, I was wondering if that's what you're trying to say with those first few words before the comma. You're saying climate threat and threat aspects, like what about those? It's like understand those, or
have been assessed, or
yeah. And then the idea of the design, I like the idea of design standards. I mean, that's going to mean different things for different infrastructure.
Mm-hmm. How does that look? Climate threat and threat aspects have been assessed, and resilient design standards for infrastructure projects have been created and are incorporated into planning of publicly funded projects. And to Anne's point in the chat, agree. I think, yeah, similar to what you said the last time, before we have the resources to implement, there needs to be a willingness to do so. I think there's going to be, and I don't know if it's something that we got to in strategies discussion under pathways, but there's going to be a really big, education may not be the right word, but a component around education, information sharing, communication of the need to be able to make these changes. So. Any other thoughts on these, or should we move on?
Our grammar assistant wants to listen to active voice. So we can
go back and adjust that.
Yeah.
So thinking about time, can we go ahead and let's move on to the next one, because this is, yeah, this one we don't have goals for, which is why we want to talk about it. So pathway 3 is around supporting the reduction of municipal, school district, and residential fossil fuel use in rural areas through the equitable best practices that address unique challenges of rural communities. We did not develop goals for these, wondering if folks think these are covered by the mitigation reduction requirements, although it is a slightly different approach that are already addressed in the cross-sector mitigation subcommittee, has been assigned to work on through the Global Warming Solutions Act? Or do we think there are measurable goals that we can include in here that perhaps address, mitigation and reduction requirements, but aren't directly related to the greenhouse gas reduction requirements that are called out in the law? Sorry, that was a lot, but we didn't develop any goals for this, and I'm curious what folks think about either needing additional goals, or do we think that this type of work and these goals are covered or would be too close to the mitigation requirements that we already have?
Speak, Chad. You're in that committee.
Yeah. I think this is a good opportunity to have some measurable goals, right? I mean, if we're talking about a reduction in fossil fuel use for these various groups of entities, it seems like here we could put some target goals. I don't know what they are. And again, with the equity lens on, but it seems to me that, we should have some goals here. And that, what's going on in cross sector, I think is much more kind of big picture, electrification. So fuel switching basically, but not necessarily putting targets to that fuel switching.
This specific topic came up yesterday for those that watched the House Energy and Innovation. There was questions about the older municipal buildings and other buildings in these rural areas, and what are we going to do there? So I do think it's probably good to keep it.
Way back in the days of ARA back in 2008, we audited or did thermal energy audits of over 90% of the buildings in the Northeast Kingdom. Municipal.
Right. Yep.
Right, you showed us a couple of those. I think that some of those reports are actually online.
Yeah.
Yeah, and actually, Chad, you bring up a good point, because I think, and this has actually come up in multiple subcommittees, is cross-sector is really thinking about mitigating greenhouse gas reduction requirement or greenhouse gases, but no subcommittee has really dove into how do we encourage folks to use less, right? It talks about electrification, it talks about weatherization, but how do we actually, you don't need 3 cars. Let's think, 2 cars or less. So it may be worth, and I don't think we have time to do this today, and that's okay. We can go to the Climate Council and say that we think there need to be measurable goals here that differ from the greenhouse gas reduction requirements set out in statute. And here's why.
Yep.
Thoughts on that approach? Do folks think that we'd be able to come back together next week to think about these goals, or do people want to volunteer to think about them next week and could come back with them on Friday?
It's helpful to me if a group, much like this, if somebody writes something that we can respond to.
Yeah, I think we should come back to it.
Yeah, and in the questions yesterday, in-house energy, talking to the Climate Council reps, the efficiency and weatherization came up, and they even wanted more. Okay, that's great, but what about the fuel switching, to Chad's point? So
yeah.
So I'm going to throw this out there. Feel free to reject it. The folks that worked on this specific pathway, I think it was Dave and Chad.
That's it.
Would you all be willing, I could send an email to get it going, but to do some brainstorming around these goals, you could even just do it through email because that's less than a quorum. And then we could discuss it a bit on our agenda for next Friday.
Sure. Yeah, we can do that.
Great. And if folks have ideas, feel free to drop them in the chat too, to help brainstorm. All right, so moving along, pathway 4. So this one has quite a bit of red text. I think, Bronwyn, did you go into the sheet afterwards and adjust this one more? Or?
I did.
Okay, I thought so.
Which is why it's in red to flag it.
It's great, yeah.
For discussion.
All right, so this is a big one. This talks about land use policies. So the pathway is around change Vermont land use policy. So current and future land development will be adaptive and resilient to climate change impacts by promoting compact development, enhancing the capacity of natural and working lands, and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So 2025 talks about the portion of residential and non-residential development and redevelopment is either within or near an eligible state designated area. Quickly, do the ACCD folks want to just define what a state designated area is for folks on the phone who may not be aware?
It's hard to do in 2 seconds, but there are areas, I mean, you know, that the state has gone through a process through standards to designate kind of a compact center for intense development, more intense development. They typically have the water and wastewater infrastructure needed to support compact growth. There's varying degrees of designation all the way up to villages, which are very, very tiny, to larger growth center areas that talk about, you know, where are you going to plan and grow for the next 20 years. And there's a bunch of gradations in between. Some of the criticisms that we get about the designations is they're too small an area. And so we do have an alternative method to look at, and we're just calling them just generically walkable centers, you know, and looking at how far can you reasonably walk within, you know, an area. And they are maps, but I think there's just familiarity around what a designated center is for now. There is talk about changing them. Sorry, I'm getting into the weeds. But I think for now, this is probably a good proxy, you know, for what we need for smart growth. It's not perfect, but it's what we have.
Okay, great. So I'm just running through 2030 and 2050. Hopefully you've had a chance to look at them. So 2030 is then getting to the portion of residential and non-residential development has increased over 2025. So it's a really similar goal, obviously, to 2025. And then we have no new development or redevelopment in flood vulnerable locations. And then 2050 is Vermont's natural working and settled lands work in harmony to support the adaptive capacity of Vermont's people, communities, and ecosystems with no net increase in greenhouse gas emissions from new development. Or we flip that to say, Vermont's people and communities work in harmony to support the adaptive capacity of Vermont's natural working and settled lands. So 2 things I want to flag before we get thoughts on this. One, we had a lot of discussion when we met to discuss these about the focus on compact settlements, and does that really meet the charge of the Rural Resilience and Adaptation Subcommittee by focusing, you know, a pathway and goals on compact settlement and sort of, and because of that, slightly more dense, perhaps urban settlements, are we not focusing enough on changing land use policies impacts on rural communities? I think that gets to many things that we may not have answered quite, is how do we define rural communities? What are we talking about when we say rural communities? What do we think they meant when they wrote it in the Green Global Warming Solutions Act? But something to think about as we go through this. And then my other thing is with 2050, it does read a bit just like a pathway reworded. And I'm wondering if we just need to think about, you know, whether that's something that we want to state for 2050 or if there's a different way to state it. So, but I'll open it up for thoughts. Does anybody have ideas on this, reactions to what I just said?
I just wanted to respond to the focus on eligible state designated areas, and I agree. You know, that's a good enough proxy for the idea we're trying to get at. But you know, if the remainder of it is all exurban sprawl, then we haven't. You know, whatever proportion we set that's close to the designated area, that's great. But if the remainder of it is all sprawl, well, we've really lost the battle, and we're not maintaining the pattern, even as the majority of it is closer to a center. So I'm wondering if we can add a little bit about reducing exurban sprawl outside of the proportion that's close to the state designated area. Focused on hamlets, I don't know what. Chris, I'm looking to you. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I'm just wondering if, you know, I do feel like the conversation with Ag and Eco may help, you know, pull this, you know, it's one, we're talking about more dense areas, and then the other side is, you know, the settled lands, but then there's this nether space that you're talking about. And, you know, we struggle with, you know, sprawl repair. You know, these areas are highly infrastructured already. We have a lot of housing needs. You know, these are probably going to be good places to improve over time. But and we do have tools to do that, but it's always a tension point between our existing centers being historic centers being the priority and these other things being lesser priorities. So I don't think it's something we can solve in this area, but I think you have a point, I guess is all I can say.
Do you mind if I just kind of connect on with that before we go to Bronwyn? I'm actually kind of surprised. It's also about, I mean, ex-urban, that word by itself, most Vermonters will be like, huh? But I think, aren't we really worried about rural residential sprawl? Isn't that like, maybe even more of a threat than I agree. There's like all this development right around our centers that hasn't been very planned very well and all of that, but it's usually, relatively speaking, within a mile or so. And I'm just thinking about my own town in Huntington. We have these neighborhood districts around our centers that are just 1 acre zoning and no form, not connected by anything. But then there's the rest of the town, which is, how do we sort of protect that from the rural residential sprawl that's happening?
Go ahead, Bronwyn.
Just wanted to make note that one of my edits may not have made it in here, but for the 2030 goal, I think the term that we're looking to use is floodway. I'm learning a lot about the different terminologies that are used for different flood zones, but I think floodway is the area that we'd be looking to define.
Is that what Ben responded in his email with? Because anyway, I'll have to go back and check. He responded with something else saying that maybe it was floodway was too specific of a FEMA term. And so saying flood vulnerable may be the better one, but we can go back and double check.
We should check in with A&R. There's about 7 different kinds of flood areas, and it's very confusing.
I think the point that we were looking to make, though, is that there's an advantage to having a fairly narrow definition in that land area to align with some of our other objectives around compact development in designated centers. And back to the idea of having realistic goals. There's 100-year flood inundation zones, and maybe the best idea isn't to say abandon or forget all development in those areas, but to recognize that they need to either be redeveloped or designed to be able to withstand a 100-year flood, more adaptive first floor uses, et cetera. So I think the intent from my division's perspective anyway, was to make this goal about limiting it to that floodway, the sort of more narrow definition, or the least land impact.
I like that because, the Vermont landscape is already out there, right? People are looking to us to how can we make the existing landscape more resilient versus changing what's already there. So that more narrow, I like that, Brown.
And this also touches on ag and eco too. If we create increased flood storage opportunities up and downstream, perhaps the risk will get reduced in our settled areas. So there's opportunities there.
Stephanie, you may have something to add. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I think the floodway, if that is what we're trying to say, maybe that's okay. But the floodway is a very specific, very narrow area. So I don't think that really gets us very far just to say, let's not develop in the floodway anymore. I think it's already really hard to develop in the floodway. So I wonder if it's maybe, and I'm certainly not trying to suggest that we stop developing in the floodplain and like in somewhere, we're not going to abandon the city of Montpelier, for example, among many others. But I think maybe there's a way to say that we're not developing in the river corridor where that's feasible. And the river corridor is a much larger area where it's the meander belt. And not feasible is not very well defined. So maybe we can define that a little bit better. But I think there's a way to say, if we decide places like Montpelier should still be developed, that we're
conserving those areas that are around in the rivers around those downtowns, and making sure that we're not making the problem worse. So I don't know how exactly to phrase that. I think no development in the floodway is a pretty low bar.
And I think that was, Ben offered some comments after Bronwyn and Ben and I met, and I think he had a similar point that the floodway is very, very narrow. And so that's why he offered, I believe it was flood vulnerable areas or something like that.
Right, and the river corridor is how we had that mapped with the Agency of Natural Resources. That's the meander belt of the river where the river wants to be. And somewhere in Montpelier, the river corridor isn't going to be much anyway, because it's so incised that it's not going to move within that area.
Mm-hmm.
So that might be a better proxy. And I don't think no development is feasible, but making sure that we figure out where that development shouldn't be and where it should is important.
So you're suggesting potentially changing this to say, and no new development or redevelopment in the river corridor when feasible.
Yeah, I that's still, that's maybe not specific enough. That's the struggle I'm having, but I think that's closer.
You should check with A&R, because it's possible that even like the floodplain goes beyond the river corridor. There's this weird, there's a right term for it.
Right.
The river corridor may not cover everything, may not cover the entire hazard area.
Yeah, so river corridor is a better proxy for our risk because it covers our erosion hazard area, which is typically broader than the special flood hazard area, which is based on inundation flooding.
And to complicate it further, A&R's existing policy is to allow redevelopment within centers, so long as it doesn't increase risk. To what Stephanie was saying, there's managed corridors, they're not going to move, they're rip-wrapped, Montpelier's not going to move, but so long as your new development doesn't increase risk for anybody else, then it's allowed, doesn't encroach the river any worse or any more than any other buildings. So it's pretty technical. I don't know if we're going to solve this one here, but or we're just all too tired to solve it. Maybe.
We may be losing steam. Let's, I'll take some notes on this and make it look a bit better. Should we talk about 2050 or do folks want to move on to another pathway?
If I could just real quick, I think devil's always in the details, right? But like, how much have we increased, between now and 2025? How much will we increase from 25 to 30, right? I think, you could have you could have a tiny increment and still increase it, and that would not be success, right? So just want to be cognizant of that, like how much. Yeah.
So we can volunteer to talk with the A&R to kind of make sure we're kind of out of time too, which.
Well, so I think Rob Evans is technically staff on the subcommittee, so we could certainly reach out to him and get his thoughts on this one. I think it's perfectly feasible to go, I can package this for a presentation to council and say, these are the things we're still thinking about. So we have these goals, these are what we're thinking about. Let's have a little bit of discussion about them at the Climate Council. I'm sure folks will have opinions on this, and then we can take that back and finalize. So we can have the slides have some questions or thoughts we're still considering. We don't have to finalize them all today. Yeah, thanks, Stephanie. So yeah, we'll reach out to Rob. He's technically on the subcommittee. So do we want to chat about 2050 or do you think we should move on at this point? I think, also, yeah. What do folks think?
It does sound like a pathway reworded, and it would be great to add some meat to it, but my capacity to do that at this moment is limited.
Well, I'll put some ideas down. And I can send them out for folks later today. But let's go ahead and move on to the last pathway. All right, so pathway 5 here. is ensuring that all people have access to safe, accessible, energy efficient, and affordable housing in location efficient, compact, mixed-use neighborhoods with diverse housing types, equitable access to jobs, services, schools, recreation, and diverse transportation options. And do you have a comment about this one or the last one? Go ahead.
Just about this one, thanks. I just wondered if you had talked about adding in energy in here, what with the energy burden report. And so I don't know if that's the right income level, but housing, energy, and transportation or something like that for 2030 and 2050.
Yep, 100% agreed.
So what do folks think? 2025, we have livable housing units have increased. We haven't defined by how much. We could if we think we should put a number to that. Diversified in cost and size. 2030, we're starting to attach percentages, and we can certainly discuss and change these as needed. 80% of households earning the area median income by county spend less than 45% of their income on housing, energy, and transportation. We may want to change that if we're then adding in transportation, because I believe the housing and transportation costs is a percentage set by groups that kind of look at those together in the picture of an overall household budget. So I'm not sure if we want to then change, they're spending less than 50% of their income if we're adding in energy. Anyway, and then 2050, we're moving on to households earning by 100% are spending less than X amount.
You could couch it like total cost of housing that could include all these other subcomponents.
Okay. So we would say less than 45% of their income on total cost of housing and transportation.
Yeah, call out parentheses, including energy. Parentheses, including energy.
Is that 45% a typical target for the combination of those three things? I mean, I've always heard housing is like 30%, of your income.
Bronwyn, I don't know if you want to weigh in. There is, there have been studies, I think, on the combined cost of housing and transportation. And I think the general consensus is if it's over 45%, then you're considered cost burdened.
Yeah, to let people know where this came from, I borrowed it pretty much wholesale from a sustainability framework called Star Communities, which is very much looking at community level sustainability metrics. But this is work that group has done to define, for all communities across the country, what would be the ideal goal? What's the target for what's considered affordable in terms of your housing cost relative to your income? So housing and transportation relative to income.
And then, so the total cost of housing in my mind also includes your transportation. So I don't know if that parentheses should count that. Bronwyn, I don't know, do you have thoughts or is it a word of art? I just
yeah, it might be more of an art as opposed to a science there, but
I think it's worth calling out transportation separately though.
Yeah.
How do folks think about the percentages that we've attached to 2030 and 2050, 80% and then 100%?
Should be easy to achieve. No
Yeah.
problem. Yeah.
Do we know where we are today? Like probably not right now.
Well, don't even get me started about data. We don't even know where the housing units are. So, but we'll get there.
Those will all be actions included in the plan. How to find those.
I would do AMI by county because there is a lot of variety. Chittenden County versus some of the other counties are quite different.
So you agree by county?
Mm-hmm.
Joe Segali.
Oh, Joe, you're not on mute. I'll mute you. Okay. Any other thoughts on these?
Mary, I have a higher level thought that we discussed on our call.
Yeah, go for it.
Tuesday, and it was more about the pathway itself and how it aligns with the mission of the rural resilience. And I still wonder if there's anything we can do with the pathway that is more inclusive of these existing landscape. Because we were tasked with getting more resilient in the rural areas, right? And if you read the pathway, it really talks about location efficient, compact, mixed use neighborhoods. So just thinking about how we can say, let's become more resilient everywhere, along with creating location efficient, just a thought. I got some feedback that's driving this too, is, you know, a lot of people were thinking, let's get resilient in the existing communities where they are, was kind of what they were thinking. And so just a thought. I don't know if anyone has any thoughts on how we could add that.
I just don't know how you, I struggle with that one. You know, this is just enabling housing options in these areas. It's not ignoring becoming resilient everywhere. I mean, we have the built landscape we have. Presumably this plan is going to help everybody become more resilient. This is about, you know, a cross-cutting strategy, you know, because if housing is located closer to jobs and services, then we drive less and we drive down the emissions. If we say everywhere is the priority, then we're leaving this opportunity and we're taking it off the table. So I don't know how to reconcile that.
Yeah, maybe my point, like we said in some other places, maybe this is covered in another pathway too, such as the infrastructure.
Dave, do you want to expand on what you just sent me in the chat? You said neighborhood areas. Are you proposing that?
So you have in the pathway, it says neighborhoods, plural, areas, plural. It should be.
Oh,
Yeah,
sorry. I thought it was a solution to our question. What do folks think? It's interesting. I think I'm just going to jump back quickly. You know, Pathway 4 also talks about compact development, as does Pathway 5. And to Mike's point, I do just want to, you know, think about, and it's difficult, right? And we've wrestled with this. One, how are we defining rural, and how are we, you know, in a way, supporting rural development by promoting compact development so that there's not that sort of sprawl pressure on those rural communities. But also want to ensure that everyone has equitable access to diverse transportation options and services. And the best way to do that is through promoting dense development. So I see your point, Mike. I'm not sure how to address it.
Didn't you read something that we are tasked with in the Global Warming Solutions Act or somewhere where it pointed this out?
Yeah, I could pull up the act language. I don't have it off the top of my head, but it's something around, you know, the end of the charge says addressing the impacts that climate change adaptation will pose on rural communities. So it's not just helping them to adapt, it's also the policies that the state or other, you know, state may or municipalities put in place to adapt to climate change may have some pretty heavy impacts on rural communities, and the charge, at least defined in the act, is that we also look at that component.
So hearing that again now, maybe this is fine.
It all comes back to what we mean by rural. So.
Yeah. Okay. Any other thoughts on this? You can let it sit for a bit too. We have about 20 minutes left, and I do want to talk just a little bit about work planning and then our approach for Monday.
And then we need public comment too. This is Ian's last day, I think, on the job. So we give him an opportunity to absolutely speak.
Absolutely. Okay, so.
Oh, cool, thanks guys.
Ian, we all saw your email that you're heading out.
Yeah, I guess it gets read. Yep.
It does. Okay, well, thanks folks so much for your attention to these. I'm going to clean these up and then I'll share them. I think to think about Monday, because Erica may be dealing with Tropical Storm Henry and Catherine is dealing with some other stuff. Who wants to volunteer to help present this to the council? Looking at our council members, we've got Chris.
Erica's busy, then I'm really busy, so.
Mike might be busy. Chad.
I don't have as firm a grasp on it. Can you do it, Marion? Or can we delegate? It's got to be council.
I think it's better if we have a council or subcommittee member presented as opposed to myself as staff, A&R staff. Well, go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, I was gonna say maybe Brahman and I can do it. Since I was not involved in the conversation and negotiations around it, I think then maybe it's a good compromise between you have the representation you need, but then you've got the technical policy person there.
Yep.
That sounds good to me.
Yeah, if you all feel comfortable with that, that would be great. And I think relieve some stress on Catherine and Erica.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So next up, so I'll clean this up. I'm going to do that today after this meeting, and then I'll send it out to everyone, but I'll send it especially to Bronwyn and Chris, so you all can take a look at that. I think I'll probably just use the same PowerPoint as a framework. All right, let me stop sharing my screen here.
Thanks, Chris.
Yeah.
Volunteering.
Be careful what you ask for.
Thanks in advance. Yeah.
All right, so next on our agenda, I just wanted to talk a bit about where we're going from here. And give me just a moment because I have a schedule that I was going to pull up for you all. Talk amongst yourselves, just have to pull it up.
If we could just play some interstitial music right now, just a little mental break,
Yep.
Joe, you like to sing. No, I'm teasing.
Jay, any major changes on the track and forecast? If we have 3 minutes to burn.
Yeah, let's talk about the weather. There's that slight kind of western push to the track seems to be a tendency, but nothing substantial. I feel like it's still mostly a Southern New England coastal event, and it just doesn't quite have that sort of interaction with mid latitudes and fronts to really stay together by the time it gets up here, which is good for us.
Okay, I'm ready to share.
Thanks, Jay.
Update. So let me share my screen here. It says Ag and Eco because we use the same work plan for them, so ignore that. So thinking about our work plan, we are presenting, so Chris and Bronwyn have thankfully volunteered to present on the goals and the vision to the Climate Council on the 23rd. The next big deadline for this subcommittee is a presentation of initial suite of actions and strategies on September 28th. So about 5 weeks from now is when we'll be starting to look at the package of actions and strategies from the Rural Resilience and Adaptation Subcommittee and the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee. Cross-sector mitigation will be presenting theirs along with the technical analysis on October 5th. So actually there's going to be 2 Climate Council meetings in a row because the technical analysis is not going to be ready for when we originally thought they would be able to present it. So in that time, I'd like to start thinking about how we frame up, whoops, and we can delete this. How we frame up the work of coming to consensus around strategies, where they fit under pathways, and then the actions, which are really the steps that we need to get to that, like our work plan, essentially for a proposal in the climate action plan. Built into this process is going to be a discussion around, what are those actions that are really ready to implement for the near term, and then what perhaps are those for the longer term, as well as working with the consultant on the equity screen. Those pieces will come a little bit later. So let's just think about development of strategies and action. So if you recall a couple weeks ago or months ago, you all were broken up into different task groups to start thinking about primarily pathways, but I think you all developed some strategies and actions under them because we presented strategies and pathways to the Climate Council a couple meetings ago. So I don't have a good sense of how far you all feel in your task groups you made it in terms of strategies and actions and what work needs to happen from there. But I'm curious if you all think reforming those task groups and going back together to think at the pathway level about strategies and actions that are needed, or if we need to perhaps reform groups around the pathways to do that work. Do folks have thoughts on that? Or anybody want to give me a reaction on, recalling the work that you all did? Do you feel you have a complete suite? Let's start with the strategy level. Do you feel like you have a complete suite of strategies, or given the conversation we've had today, and do you think that there needs to be more work on the strategies?
Yes.
So here's my proposal. So I think, and I actually need to check with Erica. I think all of the strategies are in that Miro board that she used at one of the meetings. I don't quite recall. I think they're all in there. What I can do is take that and put it in a spreadsheet so that we have everything that we've worked on thus far in the same place and have it organized by pathways. I think what we should put on the agenda for next Friday is I can walk us through that, and then we start to think about how to divvy up the work in terms of ensuring that we feel comfortable with the strategies and then the actions below those that are associated with the pathways. So I do think we're going to have to sort of reform groups, not around the tasks, but around the pathways instead. Does that sound okay to folks?
You know what I'm going to ask? How is this working with the other committees? Are we still going to stay in our little pipes? And
so for now, I think for this Friday, we still want to look at it just at our subcommittee level. That is, I think, and I've talked to folks about this, where that CAP or Climate Action Plan Drafting Committee proposal comes into play is a group of counselors that will look at the pathways across all of the subcommittees, or excuse me, yes, all of the subcommittees, and see where there are those cross-cutting ones where we need to work together. I'm going to touch base with Jane next week about potentially getting some of those conversations rolling before that proposal is brought to the to the subcommittee, sorry, to the steering committee. Because as you've identified multiple times, Chris, the land use piece is really big and we need to start looking at it now so we don't have sort of competing priorities coming out of the land use, multiple land use pathways that are out there. So, but I think at least for the near term, for Friday, I can pull together that list of strategies and pathways and then identify some that may already be actions and send that out in advance, and we can start to look at that at the meeting on Friday. As well as, take any feedback from the Climate Council meeting this Monday and put that into our goals. Does that sound okay for the near term? And then we can kind of think about divvying out work for September.
Yep.
Okay, great. Any questions or things that feel we need to discuss before we move to public comment?
All those strategies are on the Miro board and you can export to Excel. Let me know if you need help.
I might need help. I'll follow up with you, Jens. That'd be great.
And I believe Brahman pulled the smart growth. We had a list of smart growth actions. I think they're already pulled and categorized, so we can get
Great. I may have that, but if you could share it again, that would be helpful. Okay. All right. Well, at this point, oh, Chris, actually, I'll turn it back to you as leading this meeting.
Do we have any public comment? Now's the time. Ian, I want to hear from you.
Yeah, I guess kind of, for lack of a better word, it's kind of on brand for me to speak up right now. Yeah, thank you guys for, the acknowledgement. And let me first do my substantive comment, and then I'll just kind of do my parting thoughts, which is, capacity, capacity, capacity. As I was saying in the chat, the best tools are the ones that can be used. And I think you need people who can use them, and to Anne's point, people who are supported in how to use and implement them. So the more that you all can emphasize the importance of that throughout your recommendations, I think the better. I think that's a message that needs to come through loud and clear, at least from my perspective, from having worked for rural communities, as a big gap that the Climate Action Plan can hopefully help identify as the need to be filled and then actually get.
Looks like my headphones died just at the right moment, so let me know if folks can't still hear me, if there's weird echoes or not. But awesome, thank you for the thumbs up there, Chad. Yeah, so as folks saw, I am heading off from VNRC. September 3rd is going to be my last day for a lot of reasons doesn't make the most sense for me to head back to Vermont at this moment. I've been working remotely from my childhood home in Wyoming during the pandemic. Didn't want to leave my older father alone in a place where, let me tell you all, the COVID attitudes are utterly insane. So I have nothing solid lined up yet, a few irons in the fire. You know, I'm looking to continue to be useful in the energy and climate space wherever I end up. Have missed the West, so would like to work out here, but you know, I'm not necessarily wedded to any particular geographic area at this point. And I'm also, if you know, the professional job market continues to be somewhat insane, I'm also exploring potential opportunities for law school. Just took the LSAT this last Monday, actually. Just trying to keep options open. So all in all, I want to stay useful to this work. I, again, appreciate the opportunity to chime in at these meetings and follow this important work. I hope that my contributions have been helpful, and definitely know that, you know, from an organizational standpoint, VNRC will have someone else be tracking this meeting so that we can, you know, both follow what's going on and be helpful as a resource to you all as we move into the kind of engagement and implementation stage of things. So thank you all for all of your good work and thinking. And I'm sure we will see each other again at some point.
Awesome. Best of luck and thank you. Any other comments? Oh my gosh, we might land the plane before the buzzer rings. So I just want to thank everybody who worked pulling together the goals. That was a lot of hard work, and I know it's hard to edit on the fly. So thank you all for doing that, and thank you, Marion. I don't know how you do more than one thing at once. I'm an old guy, and I would fall down and fail. So great work there. And hearing, is it that time to adjourn? I think it is. I don't think we have to vote, so I think we can just be done.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye.
See ya.